Hey folks, this is Austin here, introducing you to our Otaku Unite documentary review, and I just wanted to pop on here really quickly to say that the podcast that you're about to hear was recorded over a year ago. Isn't that ridiculous? We posted that we were going to be doing this episode like ages ago, and probably most of you have forgotten, but those that didn't forget, we didn't forget either. This episode just happened to sort of fall through the cracks during our production schedule. We got really busy, and I will admit I was also super busy with like grad school and work stuff, and just didn't have the mental capacity to get this sucker released because it had a little bit more audio hiccups in it than a normal episode that we had. So I just kept putting it off, and we recorded other episodes, released other episodes, and then suddenly it was an entire year later. But here it is. I think it's largely, it largely doesn't really feel like a podcast that was recorded a year ago. Maybe some of the things that we mention are a little bit outdated. This particular episode was a lot of fun to do, a lot of fun to put together, and I'm really excited to finally share it with you guys, so please enjoy.
I see people dressed up real kind of like Star Wars like. I guess they're doing the characters out of the comic books, I guess.
Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of the Third Impact Anime Podcast. My name is Sully and we're doing another entry in my personal mini-series, Otaku-mentaries, where we look at the various documentaries that have covered otaku subculture and anime fandom that have come out over the years in America, Japan, and elsewhere. With me today, I have Austin.
I prefer to be referred to as Ogre, Convention Security.
And Tobias.
Yep, I'm here, maybe not entirely mentally present, but...
And we have Bill.
Got my ska and punk mixtape that I'm going to play as we get ready to go to conventions next year.
And if you're able to guess from the sort of esoteric introductions everyone has given, we are talking about the... film, in quotation marks, documentary in scare quotes.
The latest addition to the Criterion catalog.
Oh god. We're talking about the 2006 release, Otaku Unite.
Otaku means obsessive nerd.
This is a documentary that I have very vivid memories of watching for the first time because it was back when I was interning at the vintage store, and Austin and our friend Jamie came over to my apartment that I was living in at the time, and Austin said, "Sully, have you ever seen Otaku Unite?" And I said no, and then Austin's eyes lit up the same way, like a predatory animal, like its eyes light up when it witnesses vulnerable prey, and that is when he whipped out his laptop, hooked it up to my TV, and he forced me to watch this.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
Otaku Unite is not so much a documentary as it is kind of a carnival sideshow that has been committed to film. I have a lot of issues with this movie, but I think as we discuss it, a lot of that's going to come out, and I'm going to try to keep my rage and my sort of academic need to have things discussed in a serious, incisive manner.
So what you're trying to say, Sully, this is pretty much the real life version of The Ring, because Austin made you watch it, and now you had to pass on the curse to us.
Yeah, I was very convinced, like, for some reason I had it in my mind that Tobias had already seen this movie, and then when I linked the YouTube video of it to the Discord we use to plan the podcast, I just saw in real time him say, What did you make me watch?
Sully, I live these days. I don't need to watch a documentary.
Yes, as we discussed, I had asked Tobias back in those primordial times when you had to hitch up your brontosaurus to go to the nearest anime con. Is this what it was really like? Is this what it was like in those halcyon days? And you said that yes, it was. I actually love that. I know exactly the day that I watched this movie for the first time because Austin tweeted about it. It was July 12th, 2018. The
Just
night of
over
July
2 years
12th.
ago.
Just over 2 years ago when I first saw this film. Thank you, Austin, for documenting this important part of my life's narrative.
Oh, it's absolutely my pleasure, and I guess I'll be the odd man out and say that there are parts of this documentary that I really like and appreciate. So hopefully we'll have a lively discussion about it.
Austin, when was the first time you saw this? If you able to remember?
I can't pinpoint to you exactly when I saw it for the first time, but I know that I bought a used copy of it at the local used bookstore, which is almost where I get about 90% of the DVDs and Blu-rays in my collection is from the used bookstore. Support your local used bookstore. So I saw it there and I thought, wow, this looks really interesting. It has a Central Park Media logo on it, so that means it has some degree of officialness, I guess, but thinking about Central Park Media, they'd pretty much license whatever. But I was really fascinated by it, and it on first glance, it looks like the most 2000s thing ever, because it really is the most 2000s thing ever. And especially the box art. Like, I'm sure if people haven't actually seen this documentary, maybe they've seen the box art, maybe they've seen it at their own used bookstores before. And it's just got, like, some very dated, like, digital camera, hyper flash photography of very dated cosplayers on the front with those extremely, like, shiny wigs that were very common back then, like, very Halloween store wigs, not like the really fancy ones you can get today that most cosplayers get, and just everything looks just a lot cheaper because it probably was. And there's no shame to that. It just looks very dated, so it stands out to our, 2010s, 2020s sensibilities of, what sort of glamorous cosplay convention sort of imagery looks like nowadays.
Yeah.
It really does radiate that naughty oddies energy, doesn't it?
It really does, and it just looks like it kind of looks like something somebody would like make and then print themselves in their own garage, which is, I mean, not too dissimilar from the truth.
So, Bill, when was the first time you saw this?
Austin is the ring bearer, because he said, "Bill, you like documentaries. You should watch this." And he I think he either let me borrow his DVD copy or he sent me the YouTube link, and I watched it. And I said, "This, like you've been saying, this is very 2000s." I think there's some good parts in it. Like the interviews with Helen McCarthy, who's in it for like 5 seconds, and Fred Patton, and Carl Horn. It's also, well, it's very cringy at times. I kind of like that it was made because it's a time capsule of anime fandom at that particular time, because there's some things that happen in that film that I doubt would be seen today at a modern convention, and just kind of the tone at a convention, just how everyone's very goofy and kind of just not very reserved, I guess would be the way I would describe it. It's a lot more a goofy atmosphere in the movie from what they portray.
Yeah, to sort of expound upon that, I think the movie itself, like the content, I mean, that's pretty accurate. When we talk about it being like fever dream-esque, I think it's really more to do with the editing as a documentary itself. As far as the subject matter itself, no, that was pretty fairly accurate. Otaku-dom, anime fandom, was a lot. This is pretty much his awkward teenage years, transitioning between those times when they sort of talked about fourth, fifth generation tapes sitting in a small little hotel room on a 12-inch TV. And then what we know of fandom now, more the larger scale events with everything being more mainstream. Otaku Unite is very much that awkward teenage years where, sort of transitioning into what it is now. And so I think that's what kind of wild. I think really, probably the greatest weakness of this documentary is just the editing in and of itself.
I think one thing we need to that might help the listeners and ourselves orient ourselves with this documentary is like, when did each of us start going to anime cons? Because my first con was in May of 2010. So my mindset is kind of like in that weird middle period between when this was kind of ending and the current state of cons as they were what was beginning. So Tobias, when was your first anime con?
Mine was AWA in 2004, so right before this came out on DVD.
So that kind of shocked me because, Tobias, you only just watched this documentary for the first time in preparing for this podcast, so yep. I'm sure you'd heard of it throughout the years. How did you manage to not watch it all this time?
I have actually only heard of it from you guys.
Oh, wow, okay.
I think this is definitely not a super popular thing. It's important to realize that a lot of these things, especially from this era, these fan creations are very much insular, these community things. So like going into here, like I've heard of Kaiju Big Battle before. They went to AWA and did stuff before. I've heard that name, but I've honestly never actually went to dig into what it was. So this is the first time I've actually seen Kaiju Big Battle in this documentary, even though I've heard of it. Bill, you brought up in the pre-recording discussion, like the concept of AMVs. They don't talk about these here. The big AMV thing a few years after this would be the AMV Hell series, a thing that was very popular in its time, but now no one would jumping into the fandom would know it like AMV Hell is, for instance. So I think with Otaku Unite, this might have been a thing which went in certain circles. But honestly, I haven't heard a whole lot about anime documentaries on the whole. So I think it's just one thing that you kind of had to have been there and dug into.
I think by its nature, documentaries can be niche, and unless you're kind of seeking it out, people aren't going to engage with it. And also just by the subject matter, unless it's a very prominent name, or subject matter, people won't engage. People aren't going to be as active and know about it. So, for example, a documentary that probably more anime fans know would be the documentaries about Hayao Miyazaki. And the only reason why anime fans know about that is because I think they were put out by Shout Factory. Mm-hmm. And they were covering and looking into a very popular and prominent figure. Whereas with this is just kind of about general fandom at a particular time.
I do think maybe it's a bit telling that we do have several big name people in this, but I've not heard any one of them go out of the way to advertise this documentary. Mm-hmm. Which I think it's less, maybe not so much the content itself as the way it's directed and cut. May not be the most glowing representation of otaku, and I think even if
that's the thing. Yeah, we're definitely going to get into that later, but I think this documentary is one of those things that has a considerable portion of things that are like, wow, that was pretty good, but overall it's kind of hard to recommend as an entire piece.
It's rough, yeah.
And Tobias, when you describe it as like a community effort, I don't get that sense from the director, because I've tried to find, and we'll get into that after this, we'll go into the production of this documentary, but from what I've found on him, I don't get the sense that he was like in the community. It really kind of comes off to me as maybe he had friends who were, or maybe he just, knew about it through the grapevine, and he was like, oh, this is a subject for a film.
Right.
Even though this apparently was shot between November of 2000 and summer of 2003. So he did 3 years of this.
Yeah, Sully, I can speak to that later on, because I whenever I was watching it this time, I did watch it with the director's commentary on, and there's a few bonus features on here as well with the director. So whenever we get to that, I can discuss that some more.
Okay, but at least the sense I got was this is someone who kind of saw a story and is not part of the community. And I'm not saying that like, oh, if someone is cutting this or editing this in a way that doesn't show us in a glowing light, they must not be one of us. Because I think you could show the seedier or more eccentric, if to put a polite word on it, aspects of anime fandom, but still be a member of the community. But this really, again, there's an element of the sideshow that I find a little hard to swallow when I watch this, and a little uncomfortable. Just because there are some things where people are having harmless fun and just, living their best life, as we say in 2020. And the director, or at least the way it's edited, comes off as, oh, look at these sad, pathetic weirdos. And I think I have a huge issue with, people who just are doing their thing and not bothering anyone being kind of sidelined or shown as, oddballs. Bill, before we get off the subject, when was your first anime convention?
My first anime convention was probably in 2007. Probably Animazement 2007.
Okay.
So in terms of people who have been in, most of us have been to anime in some form or another since we were kids, but in terms of being in the con scene, it kind of goes Tobias, you, and me and Austin right around the same time.
Yeah, because Sully, we didn't know each other at the time, but our first convention was the same convention in the same year.
Right. So that gives us like a good framework as maybe how we'll each react to this too, having kind of been there, quote unquote.
That is a great way that you put it earlier whenever you were talking about Animazement 2010 as you and I, our first foray into conventions, and that really being like the tail end of the tail end of what we see sort of beginning in the events of Otaku Unite, because in 2010, the late aughts and conventions, it still had a very kind of DIY sort of feel to it. Anime wasn't quite as corporatized as it is now. I mean, there's absolutely corners of conventions that are still very DIY focused, but at this point you have like major companies sponsoring anime conventions that get, tens of thousands of attendees, and they have just absolutely exploded in the last decade. And they've always sort of been exploding since they first started, but this was still like going to an anime convention whenever we started going to it wasn't sort of like a very standard social function that lots of people do nowadays.
Right. I mean, the last anime con I went to, and I really hope it is not the last anime con I go to, was AWA in 2019. And I mean, when we were there, they had like that motorcycle from some show that you could get on. They had like all the huge displays and all the, company booths. I mean, it was wild. And that was a huge departure from even like what Animazement was like in 2010, and beyond even like the corporate influence of like having Crunchyroll and Funimation and Sony essentially being there, promoting stuff and giving out, flyers and goodies and having industry panelists. There was just sort of the cultural things of like, this was the end of LiveJournal and the beginning of Tumblr. This is when, yaoi paddles were being banned. This is where glomping was kind of going out of style. This was, I think, maybe 2011 was the last animes when I went to. Maybe 2012, where people still did the caramel dancing and the
I was just thinking about that.
Like,
2011
sort of,
was the year caramel dancing died.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of feels like, I feel as I go to cons now, I'm recognizing things like, oh, we didn't have that when I'm becoming the old people in the show where it's like, oh, you kids shaking my cane.
Well, that happens when you've got a decade in this stuff.
Well,
yeah, I mean, I do not have a TikTok. I don't care about TikTok, but all the kids now are talking about the TikTok, and I'm just like, you know what? That is how I'm sure these people are like, God, these kids and their Tumblr and their LiveJournals and their caramel dance. And
you know what's funny is that even with what you're saying, even in the documentary towards the end, they have back in my day, they didn't have to get a fourth generation VHS copy. They have so much options now, which I didn't have back in the day. So I think that's that back in my day, a mentality never goes away. It goes from one generation to the next.
And I personally have, I'm of two minds of that, because one, I think there is a bit of cane shaking, and I can be like that, and I try to watch this, like, you know what, the TikTok cosplay memes are not for me, but if you kids are, happy and healthy and doing your thing, make good choices, kids, it's fine by me. But I also think it's important when people say, like, hey, remember, you're very lucky compared to what we had to go through. As long as they're not saying, oh, it should be like it was, you have to pay $100 for a 4th generation tape and you have to suffer. I don't believe that. But I think it's important to say, look how far we've come. Like, I think making sure people are aware of their history is important, so long as you do not alienate them with it.
Right.
So how this documentary got made, the director is Eric Bressler, and according to his website, where one of the only pages that still works on his website is the Otaku Unite archive he put up, he writes, I began shooting Otaku Unite in November of 2000. Production wrapped during the summer of 2003. Its world premiere was held at the 2004 Philadelphia Film Festival. It was released on DVD courtesy of Central Park Media in June 2006. Go ahead, Austin.
That really is quite a long time for him to have worked on this thing, because, you know, you watch it and think, oh wow, this DVD came out in 2006, but so much of the footage you see is from like 2001, 2002, because I was listening to the director's commentary and they said they probably went to about 12 conventions all across the country to get all of the footage that they did at very different, you know, over the course of many different years. And one of the most interesting things that the director, and I forget who it was two guys on the commentary track. I forget who the other gentleman was, but one of the most interesting things that the director said is that he did not want to finish this documentary until he got an interview with Carl Masick. And at the time, Carl Masick was still like very wary about attending anime conventions because of a lot of the like bad energy that a lot of fans had given him for a long time at conventions. For those that don't know, probably a lot of younger fans might not be aware, and even this is sort of pre our generation too, but Carl Masick was the basically the guy in charge of creating Robotech, which was obviously a very huge influential anime that ran on network television that got a lot of people in the US to be able to be exposed to anime for the first time, like alongside things like Speed Racer and Battle of the Planets, etc. Robotech was a huge big deal. And he was kind of the face of that in the United States, for better or worse, because a lot of people really hated Robotech because it was like a bastardized version of Macross. It's a whole big dang thing. But the director was a really big fan of Robotech whenever he was a kid. So I think that is really interesting that he's just like, you know, holding his cards and waiting for the day that he can sit down and chat with Carl Masick before he puts the documentary out. And at this point, Carl Masick passed away a good number of years ago. So I think it's really nice to be able to have him in the documentary to speak to sort of the legacy of Robotech and what Robotech did to sort of lift up the popularity of Japanese animation across the United States in a very, very visible way.
Yes, as of this recording, Carl Masick has been gone for a decade now. He passed in 2010, and he really is sort of a controversial figure, but not for reasons that are mostly petty fan reasons. And even though there's a lot of legitimate criticism that can be leveled towards the Macross Robotech fiasco, most of that seems to go onto Harmony Gold's end rather than Carl Masick's end.
Yeah, I mean, this is just my personal opinion, but I think Carl Masick kind of did the best thing that he could have done for that time, because essentially what he was trying to do was do what kind of needed to be done to normalize Japanese animation for a very, very wide American audience. And you just couldn't really do that with like subtitled anime. I mean, you could make a criticism that he didn't have to change it as much as he did. And of course, I wasn't there, so I can only speak to it so much. But I mean, he seems like he did it for, he created Robotech for very legitimate reasons, but there's barely any excuse for the situation that Harmony Gold has put us in these days.
Yeah, it very much is a continuation, or maybe the origin of the same arguments we have now of, sub versus dub and censorship in anime that is, is still going on in the year of our Lord 2020. It's this idea of keeping the original work pure and, like it was intended, versus making it something that a wider audience could enjoy. And, I watched some Robotech back in the day. I don't know if you guys had watched any back then, but that's in a large way is kind of why you're here. Robotech did normalize it in a lot of ways, being one of the first things to be on TV as anime and distinctly anime. And we can speak to that being, like you said, bastardized, but there had to be something to get people in the door to begin with, and I think we can applaud Robotech for that.
Right, and that's one thing I will give Bressler in this documentary is taking the time to interview Masick and document his opinions and his information about working in the anime industry as it was in that time. I think because Masick was such a maligned figure in the community for so long, we really lost out on a lot of inside info on what it took to take animation from Japan and bring it to the States. We kind of cut off our own nose, speaking as a whole here, when it came to the treatment of Masick. So I am glad that this information was around at all. I mean, it's pretty much this and the other interviews he did and that Ancast interview he did right before he passed that really kind of fills in those gaps that we have, because there was just so much animosity that the community scared him off by sending him death threats and making him into this sort of pariah figure, and also just the fact that because he was seen as this sort of massacreist, I think there was actually a fan term that combined Masick with massacre to describe his translation jobs and his adaptation jobs. Yeah, they thought they were clever. That they thought they were cute. Because of that, we really just sort of wrote him off as like an enemy of the community, as rather someone who, as Austin put it, did what they had to do in the time period. We really think that that anime should have always just been brought over the way it was, without thinking about the fact that Japan and America have had a very complicated domestic foreign relationship with each other over the years because of World War II and the 80s economic boom and all of that. So he was kind of, did what he could with one hand tied behind his back.
Robotech was one of the real, watersheds or key events. That came along in 1984 and 85. Carl Masick was essentially the guy who made it happen.
I saw the potential of bringing something like this into the country and, exposing it to a larger audience than 25 guys in a room on a reel-to-reel tape recorder. There was a gray market of importation of toys and model kits and stuff, and I thought that it would be a cool way to increase the awareness and the sale of this product in the States, to have animation available for fans to look at in English.
So Otaku Unite really is Bressler's most notable credit, at least from what I could find on IMDb and what I could still access from his personal website. He is, taken from his website, the site editor and founder for Cinedelphia.com, the online center of the Philadelphia film community, and he is the director of programming at the Philadelphia Mausoleum of Contemporary Art. He has served as the program director for the Cinedelphia Film Festival, which ran throughout the city of Philadelphia from April 4th through the 27th of 2013, and he is the pop culture filled mind behind the found footage comedy show Video Pirates. This is all taken from IMDb and his website, and this is all as of 2013, so this is 7 years old now. I cannot find much current information except in 2017, he was on the TV documentary Outsider. He did their episode on David the Rock Nelson, who, if you've never heard of, he is a trip. He is this indie horror filmmaker who shoots everything on video with Halloween masks, and I hope they handled him with a little more care than they handled Otaku Unite. But yes, David the Rock Nelson is certainly an auteur figure in the horror world. He also received a special thanks in the credits of Birdemic 2, The Resurrection, but I'm going to guess it was probably just like he was a backer on like Patreon or whatever, or Indiegogo or whatever the hell they used to make that monstrosity. But so I just felt like, you know what, it was a special thanks. It might be worth mentioning here.
Isn't Birdemic that movie they have in Schitt's Creek?
So that is actually probably a parody of Birdemic. That is the Crowaning. Actually, the Crowaning 3. But yeah, I am almost 100% sure that has to be a direct reference to Birdemic, which was a very terrible independent film that is a ripoff of The Birds, and no one can act in it. And this is not a Birdemic podcast.
It should be.
What a shame.
So I think the thing about looking at his credits here, you mentioned earlier that he's probably was never really an otaku himself, but he obviously does have a lot of love for cinema, for movies, if nothing else, for like kitschy horror movies. And he most certainly was aware of and probably did go to some sci-fi cons, if not anime cons. I've got friends that in college were more movie nerds than they were anime nerds. So I think it is an interesting idea that maybe he wasn't so much going into this looking to make fun of the anime fandom, but he did probably interact with a lot of anime nerds and probably did want to explore that space.
And that is one thing that actually did kind of it shocked me a little bit listening to the audio commentary about how he and the other guy on there were very they were very matter of fact in the sense that anime fans, they can be a little bit awkward sometimes, but there's also such a rich art here that really needs to be celebrated by the larger film community, by the larger pop culture community. And yeah, the niche fandom spaces, a lot of niche fandom spaces, are very odd places, or at least they can be at times. But I was kind of very pleased that they, in the commentary, did not resort to sort of mid-2000s mean snark humor.
Yeah. Because
I kind of expected that, and I didn't get it, so I was very pleased. I don't know if that makes my bar too low, but
and see, I felt like there was a little snark, because there would be a moment where one of the talking heads would say something like, anime has deeper storylines than Western cartoons, and then it would cut to a Robotech dub or something, and it seemed like they were undercutting their point, they were showing stuff that was trying to say, they say this, but not really. I mean, they kind of highlight, the dubs are not that great, and the dialogue is clunky, and I don't know how much of that is okay, it's Central Park Media, we've met Carl Masick, what can we afford to put into a documentary? What can we get the rights to? And how much of it was these people are kind of full of it? Because
no, and I absolutely concede that absolutely there is a distinct difference between what a creator may think and what they actually produce, and there can be a disconnect in how some of that comes across. But I think I don't think the director was out to make something that explicitly made fun of anime fans, but I think there is most certainly some things about this documentary that maybe unconsciously or not kind of do.
Well, this documentary, it reminds me very much of those kind of features and articles about comic books in the early to mid 2000s when Marvel was starting to get big, that Biff Pang, wow, comics are not just for your kids anymore. That kind of navel gazy type of look at it, and just kind of not taking it so seriously, but also treating it as this ain't just a kid's thing anymore. I don't know if I'm describing this well, but do you understand what I'm talking about?
Yeah, no, I totally get what you're saying. Yeah. Absolutely.
I think, I would agree that there's not really, that maybe their purpose wasn't really to make fun of it. They do kind of do it on accident, kind of like you mentioned. But I do think that anime fandom then wasn't as serious as it is now. Anime wasn't this attractive, sexy fandom that everyone's into, that celebrities are watching. it was this goofy thing with these goofy characters, and your love for it, it was kind of, admittedly, we're a little immature, but we love it, and we have this passion for this stuff. We don't have to have the excuse of it being serious and for adults, not kids stuff. Like, they knew they were into this weird kind of thing, and they celebrated that in itself.
I think it's important to talk about how this documentary is kind of structured. So the first 5 or 6 minutes is actually, it's almost like a mini documentary because they don't really refer back to it, where they talk about Kaiju Big Battle, which is sort of like people dress up in Godzilla-style costumes and they wrestle with cardboard buildings. I was kind of confused. I was like, is this like a preview thing? Is it like a mini documentary? Because it felt like, maybe because it wasn't directly anime related, because it was still like Japanese culture but not animation, they didn't know how to splice it in. But it felt kind of like, it was just kind of weird sitting there at the beginning. It almost feels like its own separate like mini documentary.
Yep.
And then as they go on, they have like a short history of anime in America, they have cosplay, they have the cosplay contest. Like, it feels like this documentary has, perhaps because it was filmed over the course of 3 years, a lot to say, and it doesn't know how to say it. It's a little splintered, a little scattershot in places, and I don't know how I feel about that, because it kind of feels like the director was going after anything that looked shiny or looked particularly interesting, and it makes it feel incoherent in places, at least for me.
Yeah, and I know this Otaku Unite originally started out as like a student project. I mean, it lived on much further than that, and they realized that there was a lot more there that they wanted to do with it beyond just like a 10 to 15 minute like student documentary. But it feels kind of exactly what it is, which is like the very first film made by like essentially amateurs. I think it comes together better than probably a lot of amateur documentaries do, because at least they profiled like interesting and credible people throughout it, in addition to the like sort of your more pedestrian convention goers. But it's very disjointed, and that's probably because of exactly what you said, Sully, like filming it over the course of many years, and the fact that like doing a documentary about anime is such a gigantic thing to bite off. Like, because there's so many different angles you can take with it. Like, you could do an entire 90-minute documentary just on the history of fandom cosplay, or just on the history of manga, or specifically on importing anime to the United States. But they sort of try and do all of those things in the same documentary, and you kind of get a little bit of whiplash.
And this documentary is only an hour long. It goes by really fast, and I generously, I suppose I could say that the director's trying to give us a sampling of everything that the community has to offer, but it does feel a little like, I think people think anime is just one thing. Like, it's like, oh, anime is just Naruto and Dragon Ball Z and Sailor Moon, and it's that, and they don't realize that it means the entire animated output of the country of Japan, and then complicate that by saying the entire animated output of the country of Japan as interpreted and licensed and imported by Western fans, And that can mean the United States, that can mean France, that can mean England, that can mean Australia, and then complicate that by saying there are conventions for that, and people dress up, and some people do karaoke, and some people run those conventions, and some people are in the actual industry, and then it feels like people just say, I'm going to make a documentary about anime, and then they realize, oh, this is a big old iceberg underneath all of this.
Yeah, the trap that this documentary falls into is that because there's so many topics that you can cover, it basically becomes a generalist documentary, which it's a jack of all trades documentary in that because it's trying to cover so much in so little time, it doesn't give us a better understanding or give us the finer details of the subtopics like cosplay, like how anime came to America, and or just general convention culture.
And it goes down very specific rabbit holes, like doing the profile of Steve Bennett and doing the profile of everyone's favorite, Johnny Otaku. And, I mean, in principle, those are interesting things to do, but both of those guys are just like, why?
Yeah, Bennett is not really that interesting of a subject himself. He is, or at least they are not able to make him an interesting subject. And Johnny Otaku is only interesting in as much as we are meant to cringe at him and sort of shudder at his antics. And I don't think because from what I've read, from the little bit of research, Johnny Otaku probably deserves all that's coming to him. But if you're going to have like a figure like that where the audience is meant to boo and hiss or again gawk at him like he is a sideshow freak, I would have preferred to have someone who was a good fan, quote unquote good fan, like a really dedicated cosplayer, or maybe a staffer at one of the cons who like we follow and we see how much work it takes to actually put in an anime con, like someone who kind of balances that, because otherwise it feels like this is a rough sampling of anime in America, and here's this weirdo that we're going to follow around because, he's cheap entertainment.
Well, I think for them, they wanted to find somebody that represented, like, the ultimate fan, and he was probably willing to sign the NDA that would allow them to film him in different locations, like his house or his community college radio station. And because he did multiple things from cosplay to doing his community radio show to being part of the convention staff at AWA, they said, oh, this is someone that we could cover in our documentary and show as kind of an ultra fan. The problem is that he's, by his nature, is kind of awkward, and that's common among anime fans. But I think just the way they edit him, it makes you cringe, and it's not good because it just makes, I would guess, a general audience would laugh at some of the things that he says.
Yeah. It's like, I think if you showed him to an empathetic anime audience, they would kind of understand and get it. But for a general audience, it feels like we're picking on this guy.
Right, and I feel like they had opportunities like the Sailor Jamboree group, who I thought were very cool, and I actually remember hearing about in my early days getting into the Sailor Moon musicals. Like, okay, they do these very elaborate for the time cosplays, they do these dance routines, they go to different cons, why don't we talk about them? They at least one of them signed an NDA where she appeared and was a talking head very briefly. That feels like a sort of better balance. It's like, we have this guy, but we also have these really dedicated fans who seem to be a little more they perform better for the camera, for lack of a better way of putting it. I just felt like, why are we following him? Like, what is the Johnny Otaku story that Bressler is trying to get us to understand? Because really all I understand is this is a very passionate but very misguided person. And unless you're trying to use him as a synecdoche for the entirety of the anime community, I don't think that's fair, because they're very passionate, but not all of them are as... Again, the Sailor Jamboree seem to be very successful in what they do and very well adjusted. Okay, why are you focusing on the guy who seems to be, even among the other otaku in the documentary, seems to be a pariah, seems to be someone they're like, no, we don't want to hang out with him. Like, that's, I guess, where I get the disconnect is, if you're going to use him as a part for the whole, he doesn't feel like a good representative sample, because you're showing me people who are better not just because they film better, because they seem to be better people or more well-adjusted, but just because he seems to be himself an outlier.
Yeah, and one of the things that Bressler did mention in the commentary was that Johnny Otaku reached out to them about being interested, and it might just be one of those things where it's just like, oh, well, we've got this guy, and look at him, he does so much. He runs a J-pop radio thing on his community college radio station. He volunteers, he cosplays, he does all that stuff. He sounds great, and then they sort of get into it, and then it kind of falls apart later on.
Yeah, it does kind of get worse as it goes on. I mean, I agree that, yeah, this is definitely the part of the documentary where they are making fun of what it means to be an otaku and otaku people, American anime fans more so than anything. But I think, again, this is still fandom in its awkward teenage years, and he is very much a good maybe not a good representation, but in some ways definitely accurate for its time representation. You've got the guy that thinks he's going to be cool playing Tenchi songs and Inuyasha songs on his college radio station. You know, you've got the guy that tries to dabble in every aspect of the con scene, overexerting himself, someone who lives and breathes for the community, even to an unhealthy manner. And yeah,
the most unhealthy thing that he does is walk around the convention center without his shoes on.
That was pretty gross, yeah.
Sorry, Tobias, go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say, like it's still. I think the thing to take away from this is we make fun of the tone of the piece overall, but this is not entirely inaccurate. Anime fandom, anime culture, convention culture was not the more mainstream corporate thing. I used the word corporate earlier, that it is now. And even the 2010s and now the 2020s. It was very much a bunch of weirdos. You know, you've got people like Johnny Otaku. You've got the dude that carries a bone around. You've got Dave Merrill with his awful goatee and t-shirt in the hot tub. Like, this is definitely the age of nerds not being... Before nerds got sexy, basically, or learned how to dress. Like,
Tobias, I don't mean to shatter your perception, but they have not gotten sexy, and in fact, they have not learned how to dress.
It definitely has. There's at least the perception of it, nerddom being more in the pop culture, and you can make the argument that anime's been mainstream for as long as it's been on TV. That this nerd stuff like comics have been in the mainstream, the quote unquote pop culture for even through this. But these are definitely the times when you had the perception of nerds getting stuffed in lockers and stuff, and I mean. I would say use the term the first person there. Like, we in some ways embody that. We've grown up a little bit, I'd like to think, and we've gotten better. But yeah, I wouldn't say again Johnny Otaku is the best representation, but it certainly is not the most inaccurate.
I will say that what research I could do about Johnny Otaku was he was very determined to become a voice actor. To the point he began stalking industry guests, mostly from Funimation, and he moved from Tennessee to Texas, to the Fort Worth, Dallas area, where he was subsequently banned from Funimation's offices and premises, and most cons, apparently in the Tennessee area, banned him. He has since vanished off the internet. And the fact that I don't know what happened to him terrifies me, because it turns him into a cryptid.
Yep.
He's just out there.
He could be anywhere.
He
could be anywhere.
No, he's just complaining about how the cosplay contest was rigged, and that's what ruined his chances about being a voice actor.
That the cosplay contest segment where they have him very much the issue is the vast crevice that exists between, with all of us, our perceptions of ourselves and the way we are perceived by other people. This is the thing. This is the area in which cringe is born, and the vast chasm that divides Johnny Otaku's sense of himself and how other people see him could cover the length of the entire Sea of Serenity. And the
You're
moment
such a poet, Sully.
And the moment in which he, in his Inuyasha cosplay, strips shirtless and reveals to all to witness his flabby, pasty, awkwardly proportioned body. And I say this with the most generous terms I can, because it's just, again, that is what makes it so uncomfortable, is he is flexing and posing and strutting about like cock of the walk, and then everyone is cheering and whooping on, but you can tell that what he thinks of himself and what they think of him are two vastly different things, and it is very excruciating to watch.
This is
Both
definitely part of that time when the adage of, let your freak flag fly was, a thing, and that was the thing that a lot of these anime fans were latching onto. At the cons, you can, this is part of the culture. Everyone wants you to strut around in your Inuyasha cosplay like that. You're doing a good thing, and everyone welcomes you here.
But the worst part is, he didn't even take his watch off.
that's the worst part to you, Austin?
Yes.
That's the part that you remember?
Does Inuyasha wear a watch? I didn't think so.
Well, one of those little 20th century gifts that Kagome gave to him. That's that,
'But yeah, there is a sort of a disconnect between this is the part of the community you're part of, and we're all kind of weirdos here, but you are in public, and that was a hard disconnect to stomach for a lot of fans of that era.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
I have on this podcast said before, one of the things I found very comforting about the anime community is that sort of, we're all weirdos here. And as much as I support that, I think the camera complicates it, because it is not just Johnny Otaku in that moment and the people in the audience, like it would be in any other situation. Is him, the audience, and the camera injecting a film narrative and film language into that moment, and
not just the camera, the editing as well. It's another element of it. Yeah.
Right, and I think that's what also makes it, because I think when it happens in the wild without recording, without a documentation of it, there is that sort of freedom. I mean, I've seen people who, and again, despite the fact that I looked upon Johnny Otaku's body in complete horror, I try to be rather body positive, and you do at cons see people who perhaps in another social situation would not have the confidence or even the area, the space to show off parts of their body in ways that they do at cons. They wear costumes that perhaps are more revealing, or they wear clothing more revealing, or they wear clothing that would not pass as acceptable in other areas of the world or in other areas of society. And I think when it's not recorded, when it just exists in that moment, it's more pure. But when the camera is turned on them, that is when the sort of voyeuristic part started for me. Because one thing I also had an issue with is there was a cross-player who was doing Sailor Saturn. And this cross-player did not, to me, I mean, they didn't have any makeup on. I was like, honey, a little lip, a little foundation, like, a little, give us something. But, the costume wasn't revealing. The wig wasn't terrible. I mean, it was just, someone cross-playing as Sailor Saturn. And I was like, you know what? Okay, that's fine. And then the way it's framed in the documentary is, God, they even cross-dress here. Can you imagine some man in a dress? And then they interview the person. They're like, yeah, I'm a voyeur for attention, or I'm a glutton for attention, or whatever. Very good-natured about it, but just the way the documentary framed it, like, it's like, this is very early 2000s, where we're still like, the idea of queer people existing among us was still like a scandalous thought. And I had an issue with that, and the way they framed talking to the woman at the Yaoi Con. Like, it was very much like, God, can you imagine these women are attracted to homosexuals? What does this say about where Western civilization is going? Like, they look at these images of scantily clad men touching each other. Like, God, it's so... I was just like, my dude, gays exist. Like, where have you been? You go to film school.
I mean,
Yeah,
I think that's
yeah.
fair, but I think this is very much of its time. Again, you mentioned that people, cosplaying as characters of other genders like that. Not that it wasn't done, and not that it was as they mentioned, a very male-dominated space. You're going to have them cosplaying as female characters, since those are usually more interesting anyway. But like that was something that really wasn't, at least didn't feel like it was like publicly done. It was something to sort of be surprised at, almost shocked at to some degree. Talk about yaoi, but again, yeah, like talking about anime porn was not really a thing that we're not really as open about as we are now. You know, you go to a con and there's ahagao shirts, and you can just walk up to the booth with the hentai stuff, but that was something to be shocked and surprised at. So I can very much see why that was included in this documentary. This is definitely not as progressive a time as we are now in 2020.
You know, I would really like to see a documentary about like queer fans at general conventions, like anime conventions, because I mean, I have met many people in my life who are like, yeah, one of the things I liked about anime cons was I could express my gender more freely, or I could be open about being in a homosexual, bisexual, whatever relationship, because, you know, as much as I complain about how yaoi is a complicated subject, that's my final word on the matter, it's complicated, because of things like, you know, female fans really liking yaoi, it made anime cons a safer space overall for gay fans to come in. Because of the freedom of cosplay in general, the masquerade, the carnivalesque, it made it a more tolerant place for gender non-conforming people or transgender people to go and dress how they please in that environment. And I kind of wish the documentary could have understood that. But like you said, it was of its time.
Yeah.
I can only begrudge it so much, but I think there is something there. I mean, I go to cons now, and there are actual drag queens in cosplay, not people who are just doing crossplay and they only, you know, cosplay at cons as a way of doing a gender exploration, but people who like, oh, I perform as a drag queen, but I crossplay and do like a drag version of crossplay when I go to cons. Like, I think there's something there, but I guess I watched this and I was just like, again, my dude, gay people exist.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I completely agree that I would love to see somebody do a documentary or explore more about that, because I've certainly heard from more than a few trans people that have sort of started to come out and I guess awaken to sort of how they feel and how they identify through cosplaying characters of other genders. There's absolutely a thing that is not an uncommon trend.
Yeah,
sure.
I think it would be you would be hugely amiss to say that the connection between that the presence of the queer community in the anime community is inextricable, because so many people that create it, consume it, write about it, comment on it, identify as LGBT in one way or another. So it's like that is kind of just the norm. It's an everyday thing. And I think that watching this documentary, you would think that it was something other than that. But again, of course, the difference between, you know, the 2010s and the early 2000s, from this very mostly male and largely heteronormative perspective that this documentary has.
Maybe I'll make that documentary myself if I ever learn how to, like, not film with my phone. But yeah, this documentary, I can also only begrudge Bressler because he does seem to be an outsider, and I'm sure if you were to take me, if I had the skills of being a documentarian, and you sent me somewhere I was not aware of, like a subculture, I'm sure I would probably gravitate toward the things I find the most lascivious or shocking or different from everyday life. Like for us, like kind of growing up in the anime community, like at least all of us have at least gone to cons for a decade or more. Like yaoi, hentai, crossplay, cosplay in general is just such a no big deal for us. Like, I mean, I have friends who are like, I'm buying a wig, and like I'm sure other people are like, why would anyone buy a wig? I'm like, yeah, they're probably cosplaying, or like, doing drag, or maybe they just like wigs, maybe they like J fashion. Like it doesn't even register as different for us. So there is that sort of like, we're so immersed in our own community that certain things, like I have to remember sometimes when I talk to people who are, if I might use that dreaded term, normies, like I might say something, I'm like, oh wait, you don't know what that is. I forget that not everyone lives the same life and is in the same subcultures as I am, so I might have to back up and explain, or they might be a little put off where I'm like, yeah, a friend of mine bought a blue wig the other day, and they're like, why would they do that? And I'm like, oh wait, you don't really know what this is, or this is not an everyday occurrence for you.
There's some political commentary that's in the works about this whole cosplay thing. Some of the people that are running it kind of rink with the stench of hypocrisy.
So, kind of a final note on sort of the perspective that this documentary takes, but from a very different perspective. I was reading through the Anime News Network review of Otaku Unite from 2004, and this was written by Bamboo Dong, who is still with the site today, very active. And she sort of, along towards the end of the documentary, sort of points out one of the things we pointed out earlier, and she says, quote, "Even though the video was recently made, it already feels dated. All of the video clips it uses are largely from old school shows, and all the mentions of anime that are made are for the more popular series is like Sailor Moon and Ranma 1/2. Still, with something growing as rapidly as anime is in the US, it comes as no shock that anything would become outdated so fast." So I do find that really interesting that even watching this in 2004... she already saw this as dated based on essentially what is profiled in the documentary, because you see a lot about the early days of anime. You see them talk about Robotech and Speed Racer and things like that, but they don't really delve into much of the contemporary stuff. And even at this time, Sailor Moon was a little bit on the older side. I mean, they talk about Toonami a little bit, but it is very skewed to the history, which is interesting. And I think that is probably what Bressler himself was probably more interested in, because he did, in the commentary, talk about his affinity for Robotech. So I found that interesting.
Well,
I don't know if you guys had anything to think about that.
I think there's two reasons why there's so much older material. Is probably because, one, it was probably easier to either get an agreement to get those shows like Battle of the Planets or Robotech than to get newer stuff. And second, because he wasn't kind of within the fandom, he probably was not up to date with what was the big thing at the time. Because if this was 2001, 2002, probably the big things at the time were, tell me if I'm wrong, it would be like Cowboy Bebop and Trigun, probably.
Yeah, so this is the point where I realized that I'm the only one that actually watched the credits of this movie, because they do mention that there is archival footage that is that they credit to a couple people, including Dave Merrill, Walter Amos, and Lawrence Ng, who I think Sully at least is aware of. So
yes, I am very aware of Lawrence. I will have to text him and be like, wait, what did you do?
So and there are like they do like copyright credits in the end, but it is pretty apparent, kind of putting the pieces together, that a lot of that footage was just provided by some of the people they interviewed. And I didn't see Lawrence in there, but he probably, I know he's a big part of the fandom. He probably, if you're listening now, I'm just supposing, maybe you can correct us, feel free, of course, that, maybe the same open call that led Johnny Otaku to Bressler's doors maybe led Lawrence to submit some footage. And Walter Amos wasn't in here either, but he's another big name fan from the Atlanta area. I believe the Atlanta area. Usually hangs out at AWA. So I'm sure they provided, if nothing else, the Starblazers footage. And that's where I feel like we mentioned earlier how it looked a little weird when they talk about some of the they talk about anime having really melodramatic storylines, and they show a part in Star Blazers where it's just, I'm going to turn you into scrap. Some very basic stuff. But I do feel like when you look at that, and also the fact that this was done on what I imagine was a relatively small budget for a student project, they probably went with any footage they could get. And they certainly weren't going to be paying out the nose for, what was it at the time? Like you said, Trigon, Cowboy Bebop. They probably weren't going to pay to license that stuff when they could just get... Yeah, I mean, I don't think at that point, Battle of the Planets and Star Blazers, they were probably, if nothing else, tied up in licensing hell. So they probably would not have been worried about getting sued. Since all they had to do was take these older fans, old archival tapes and whatnot. So that's probably why the anime itself, the footage feels so dated.
I'll have to ask him, but I wonder if maybe someone like Lawrence, they reached out to him or vice versa, and they did a sit-down interview talking head thing, and then they just didn't use it.
Possibly, yeah.
Because there is, again, former podcast guest, Helen McCarthy, is featured in here, but she only gets maybe 2 minutes of footage, and then they don't use her anymore, and it kind of feels like there had to have been more. I'm sure they didn't just grab her on a corner to come and be like, hey, give us, say something, speak, perform. I'm sure.
And former podcast guest Robert Woodhead.
Yes, I mean, and that's a bit of a disappointment for me, because you have Helen McCarthy, you have Frederick Schoep, you have Carl Masick, you have Robert Woodhead, you have these important people. You have Dave Merrill, who even back then was not a small deal. He was still important in the fandom, at least very important in AWA. And it kind of feels like they're there a little bit, and then we follow Johnny Otaku, and I'm like, there has to be more. There has to be more of these people who I feel like are more informative, are more interesting to watch on camera, are more informed about what this thing is and why people love it, and instead we follow the man who has a 30-minute slot at his community college radio station called the Sushi Bar, which I find weirdly charming. It was in that weird period in the late 90s and early 2000s where we just thought Japan was karaoke, sushi, and Godzilla, and we had literally no other cultural references to use. We had to draw from those three things anytime we referenced Japan.
I will say they do use the those kind of more expert personalities pretty well. All the sections with Fred Patton, I think, are still very informative today, even if they are kind of general, because he was one of the earliest anime fans in America and started technically the first anime club in I think California, and just his talking about fandom, and Helen McCarthy talking about how Fred and others like him were doing archiving at the time. I think that part is still really interesting, and I would love to read a book about that, or even a mini or a small documentary about that.
Made all the more tragic that we just recently lost Fred Patton. 1 or 2 years ago, I can't recall offhand, but it was really... Fortunately, we do have a lot of his writing. We have his book, Watching Anime, Reading Manga, and I don't know. I just felt like, again, there was this feeling of the sideshow that I felt could have very easily been avoided, because I'm like, I know you didn't talk to Helen McCarthy for only 2 minutes. I know you didn't talk to Dave Merrill for 2 minutes. I know there was probably more, and probably a better through line with their interviews than following this guy around and laughing at his cosplay contest entry. I just felt like there was there's a huge chunk of information here that I feel like has to have been cut at some point.
Right. I feel like this is kind of a pearls before swine situation where, he didn't know. I don't think he quite got the enormity of getting, he knew Masick, but we have Patton, we have McCarthy, we have all these important people that to us as anime fans, even then, super, super important people, but not really realizing that that's where the story was. Thinking that if the story was, okay, here's the eccentric, weirdos, the guys in cosplay, whereas we kind of ignore, the actual historians, these important people, and not realizing that it was going to be such a big deal even 20 years later.
Or they talk to Carl Horn, who's been at Dark Horse for like a long time, where he's been their manga editor, where he briefly talks about Speed Racer for like 5 minutes. And then he comes back near the end of this, like, well, what will the future will be? And that's a real shame because of his expertise and how long he's been working with Dark Horse to publish manga. I would love to hear his take on things, but they don't really talk to him that long.
I think we'd be remiss, too, if we didn't point out that they also got Peter Fernandez and Corinne Orr, the original voices of Speed Racer and Trixie, to be in this documentary, too. And Peter Fernandez, we lost him also in 2010. So this is probably one of the last interview things he did, other than probably doing the junket for the Speed Racer movie when he had that cameo. Corinne Orr is still alive, but she's 84 at this point when I looked it up. Yeah. So, I mean, we got some interesting people here, and it just feels like, again, I could probably watch an entire documentary about either of them and their careers, or just them at a con. Like, you did this show so long ago, and it still resonates with people. It's still a part of the cultural zeitgeist, at least for the subculture. Like, what is that like? What is it like to go to a con and this thing that you probably didn't think would really go anywhere, this, a cartoon probably going to air, a few years and then go away, and now it's this, part of the pop culture lexicon of the United States. Like, there's probably a story there, but again, I just feel like maybe the real issue here is the director, Bressler, just bit off more than he can chew.
Yeah, I think that's true, because I think we've all sort of outlined some really excellent things that this documentary does, some of the very interesting people that it profiles and involves in the story of anime in the United States, or, largely in the larger Western world, rather. But it seems like it was just kind of off track, but it was like on the right track, but sort of just fell off. And I think that track falling off would be so much less like harsh in this documentary if they did not spend so much time with Johnny Otaku and Steve Bennett, who are just not the most interesting picks that they could have gone with. But I also do kind of like, you all know that I'm a huge appreciator of anime. I try and approach it from a very media studies / academic perspective, but I think there is also merit in profiling the average fan, profiling the attendee, and sort of like showing what the casual person is really there for, and really connecting that to a spirit of passion that really brings all of us to the same place, whether you approach it from an academic or a historical perspective, or just from a casual entertainment perspective. And I think that story deserves to be told, and I think this kind of tries to tell it, but it's like it does it so messy.
They talk to other fans, but they're very brief glimpses. They don't do any deep dives into kind of more average fans than just Johnny Otaku.
And that's one thing that I was thinking, if this documentary were going to be made today, and it wasn't going to be made by somebody or a team who was really invested in really the story and history of anime and telling why that's important, I think it would be all sort of, maybe not as extreme, but it would be mostly Johnny Otaku types, or mostly like English voice actors, sort of what we see being put on a pedestal at most conventions sort of broadly. I think that's kind of what it looked like. It might not feature the Fred Schatz of the world, or the Helen McCarthy's, or the Fred Pattons that exist right now, and I think that's kind of a shame, but it also sort of just points to the fact that fandom is so much bigger now. It's
much more diverse. I think if this was made today, I would like to hear more from people in the LGBT community. I would like to hear more women voices.
Yes,
and their take
yeah.
on anime fandom and their relationship with it.
Like, really, the only woman that's featured prominently in the documentary is Trish Ledoux, and she's really not even in it that much.
A very important person in the history of anime in the United States, and she just, she probably gets the most talking head shots out of any woman in there. It's probably her, Helen, and Corinne Orr, and that's it. That's our woman. That's our female representation, guys, and the one adult actress who, again, she's like, I love anime fans because they like computers, and I'm like, This feels like you put this in there as a gag. It's the same way they had the guy who's like, he goes to every Hooters and has a picture taken with the waitresses, and they all love anime. I'm like, sir, was this necessary? Does this enlighten us?
That bit where they interview the pornographic actress, that just feels like, hey, we're at this convention, can you just say something into the camera, please? And
I will say, though, that sweater she was wearing was a look. I like that sweater.
That's what Sully has to say on her whole appearances. Love that sweater.
I mean, you are getting a look who you're talking to.
I have to warn you that Hooters with Steve is like it's a religion. It's like a 3 to 4 hour experience each time.
Can we talk about kind of their predictions? Because it's kind of funny looking back at this now and seeing the predictions. Like when we were talking about the YaoiCon, how they were kind of like, well, there's going to be a bunch of sub-genre conventions that'll pop up in the future that'll cover other topics, which I found kind of hilarious now because everything has become so much more of a generalist con perspective, because that's how you get the more butts into the convention hall.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, this all kind of started coming out of sci-fi conventions. The first anime cons were there because they wanted their own space. The sci-fi cons weren't really giving them their space. So all right, we'll do our own thing with Japanese cartoons. And here it sort of predicts, we'll get even more types of cons. We'll get even more specific cons of particular shows. And I'm aware that there was like I want to say either a Star Blazers con or a Robotech sort of con way back in the 80s, in the early days. But aside from YaoiCon that they mention here, that really hasn't been the case. We've really had more of a what we call a con convergence, especially over the past 10, 15 years, with cons coming back together and doing more general purpose, all-purpose pop culture conventions. It's very rare that you've got things like Animazement and even to a lesser degree AWA that specifically focuses on the Japanese aspect.
I have sort of a theory behind that.
What's your theory?
Oh, I have sort of a theory behind that, and I think it is kind of a historical thing. So again, anime cons are sort of born out of sci-fi cons that would not give them the space. There was always, from what I've read, an antagonistic relationship between anime fans and general science fiction fans. And I think because anime cons, for better or worse, became sort of the con, like science fiction conventions were so male-centered, and so like they were just so themselves. The anime cons, which tend to draw more women, tend to draw more diverse crowds, tend to draw more diverse ages. Because of that kind of allowed for anime cons to become the breeding ground for the sort of resurgence of the general con that we're seeing now. And I think just the fact that anime cons have been so accessible to the right audiences, like teenagers, college kids, young adults, like people who usually don't have a lot of money, but who have a lot of passion, a lot of energy. I think that is what's made them become the sort of ground for the general con again, is because science fiction conventions, it's kind of like how the American comic industry is kind of destroying itself. They've become places for IP mining. They've become places where you have to go to specific comic shops to get comics. They're not just in grocery stores and drugstores and stuff like that anymore. Like, they've become so walled into their sort of like, these are the people we want in our community, that they have basically become stagnant in terms of growth. And anime cons, because, I mean, most nerds are not just into anime. They're into other things. Things that are somewhat anime adjacent, like Avatar, The Last Airbender is not anime. We must have this discussion every month, apparently. But it is anime adjacent. People who like anime will probably like that. Or they'll probably like some other thing, or maybe they have different fandoms, and like that's why we get Doctor Who cosplayers and Avatar cosplayers, and for whatever godforsaken reason, we get Hamilton sing-alongs at Triad Anime Con. Like these things, like even though that infuriates me beyond any reason, I do think anime should be centered at an anime con, or at least Japanese or East Asian culture should be like centered, because people have other interests and they're going to bring them in, and anime cons are more receptive to them bringing it in and giving them that space. That's why they're allowed to become these sort of general things, is because anime cons have been more flexible, more accessible, and more welcoming. I feel more welcome at an anime con than I have at a con that's more general pop culture, or like a Comic-Con. I feel like a fish out of water there, because I'm like, these people just do not feel like they're on my vibe.
It's I think a lot of it, now that I think about it, is definitely an age gap thing. We've got sci-fi cons have always been very much the old guard. The sci-fi community has always been about, older fans arguing about novels and whatnot. And like you mentioned, comics has sort of become this it's transitioned from being something that any kid could just jump into, could pick up an issue of Spider-Man, Superman, whatever, and just enjoy it, to being this very, I wouldn't say like canonical, you have to know these stories, you have to know this character. There's very regimented, there's very dogmatic rules about comic characters and the superheroes, and just like sci-fi, the average age of a comic fan has only gone up. And during this period, you had this new thing, anime, that sure other older fans were enjoying as well, and they were bringing into the fandom as a whole. But the general age was going down every year. You got more stuff showing on TV with Robotech, with Dragon Ball Z and Sailor Moon. Then Toonami shows up, and these kids can just watch stuff every day, these entire stories. And it's only made things more accessible for a younger audience, which I think really, both the inherent popularity of anime plus how accessible it was for a younger audience, definitely created the surge of the anime fandom in the 90s and the 2000s. That's something I kind of mentioned in my history panels, is that there definitely has been a lower average age as time has gone on.
I will also say, I think anime as a community, it just has a different vibe to it. Like I said, like when I think of the interactions I've had with like comics fans, they tend to be very like, this is not for kids, this is serious, Batman is serious, like I'm an adult, this is fine, you're not treating this with the respect. And then anime fans, like, as much as they can drive me crazy with anime is trash, it's like, kids, the stuff you like is not trash. The fact they are more like relaxed about it, they kind of realize like when anime gets ridiculous or when it gets kitschy, and they're more okay with it. I think.
I mean, just look at the popularity of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. I mean, that's essentially all that is. It's just absurdism, but people don't treat it like, oh man, JoJo's the serious thing. It's just like, no, it is silly and goofy, and that's why we love it.
Like, there are a lot of older anime fans, from what I've seen, they were really trying to push that anime as more serious and realistic and what have you, and certain anime is. I mean, you have Akira, which I think is a brilliant piece of filmmaking that is this deep and layered and full of richly articulated text. And then you have Yatterman, which is absolutely bonkers and dumb, and I love it. And I think that anime is both of those things, and I think anime fans are a little, especially now, more open to that. They're like, there's really serious anime that tackles complicated societal themes, and then there's goofy stuff like JoJo, which probably has some stuff we could read about it, but it's mostly absurdism and goofy and fun, and it's just happy. And I think that's something that lacks in a lot of comics fandoms now. Like, it's still that sort of, you know, pardon my French, it's nerd boy dick measuring contest. Like, Batman can beat Superman, Batman's real. Like, Batman, no, there can be no silly costumes. There can't be people wearing purple suits with canes. No, they have to be gritty and realistic because my dad makes fun of me still. It's like, God.
I for one, am waiting for the Otaku Unite Snyder cut.
Are we supposed to be talking about a documentary?
Oh, yes.
Well, I mean, I guess one thing I do want to mention there is we talk about the way these fandoms have transitioned over time. But I do feel like we're at a point where anime fandom could go the same way. Is it going to be a bunch of older fans just arguing about Yatterman and JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, or are we going to leave enough space for the younger audience to jump in? And if the younger audience is into Avatar and Steven Universe and other non-anime works, I think it is important to give them the space, maybe not at anime conventions, but it is important, I think, to give them the space to explore those fandoms and continue the spirit of what we do, if not exactly the letter.
I don't know, Tobias, because before the pandemic hit, just going to your average convention, the average age of the convention goer at anime cons is still rather young. Unless you're going to a much bigger convention like your Otakons or your AWAs of the world, the average con across the United States is going to be young. Where I think a lot of the older fan base is much more concentrated on the internet.
Oh, for sure. I guess I don't think it's really hit that that part yet, but I do think it's definitely going to hit a point where we as older fans do need to sort of make way and let them explore these spaces in their own, rather than try to gatekeep.
Yeah,
and
hold the gate open rather than keeping it shut.
Exactly. And that's something I do, on the one hand, I do want to vouch for the purity, like what technically is anime. We pretty much get into the 2020 version of the whole Carl Masick Robotech debate. Like, do we really want to? I think there's a happy medium between vouching for the purity and the history of these works, but also allowing them to have maybe a more loose interpretation, or more loose interpretation of the fandom for a lot of these people.
This might be just semantic, but I would push back against the word maybe purity, and maybe use the phrase like distinct cultural Japaneseness of anime as an art form, rather than the P word, maybe.
I guess you can't really see it on the podcast, but I was doing air quotes.
Oh, okay.
I tried to push the air quotes.
I knew what you were trying to get at.
Yeah. It certainly is not the actual, Macross is the only pure version. How dare Robotech exist? But I feel like you can both have the opinion that Robotech was very important to the proliferation of the fandom, but also it's not great compared to Macross.
Yeah, exactly.
And adult fans should go watch Macross and not Robotech. But at the time, it was very important.
Yeah, I
think for me, the happy medium is kind of. I'm sorry, Bill. Go ahead.
No. Yeah, I'll be brief. I would just say is to not shut down the fans that are just into Steven Universe or Avatar: The Last Airbender, because those shows can be gateways to anime in quotation marks proper. That's my point.
One thing I learned just as someone who studies literature for their education, is I found that like saying you don't know X is very off-putting, but saying, oh, you don't know this, you're in for a treat. Like, if you like this, you'll like this too. Or maybe you won't, but like, it's worth a shot. Like, I found that doing that is a lot more conducive to getting what you want, which is getting people to get into the things you are, than saying, oh, how dare you not know this? And I think that's where my issue is, because I think, okay, no Hamilton sing-alongs. I'm just going to say that. That's my hill I'm going to die on. No Hamilton sing-alongs. However, if there are some kids cosplaying Hamilton at a con, I'm not going to begrudge them. I mean, they're not hurting anybody. Like, maybe this is the only place they can do it.
I think our central distinction is making the point that what we are critiquing is not fan behavior, but convention, like, priority.
Right. I think the priority should, if it's an anime con, the focus, the priority should be anime, manga, and surrounding Japanese cultural artifacts like J-pop or
things
kaiju.
Related to same.
Right. And keeping the general con feeling open, though. Like, I mean, there's Batman cosplayers at anime cons and no one throws a fit. I think people get mad when the new thing comes in. People were mad at Steven Universe or Avatar cosplayers or whatever the new, not anime Western property was. And I think I've met some older fans at cons, and a lot of them have been delightful. They're like fonts of information and they're wonderful. And then there's some people where I believe just want to go, it's like, I know you look like a fossil, but you don't have to act like one too. Like, okay, calm down. It's fine. The kids are fine. The con is fine. This is fine. Relax.
Yeah. Well, there are people that base their identity on their fandom, and convention going can be a fandom. So there is definitely, quote unquote purity to that. I don't really mean to say we should definitely make space here. We should definitely bow down to the younger generations. I just think it's a conversation that we as a community if not already have started having, need to be having over the next 10 years as the anime fans. Now second, third generation sort of fans get older, and we who've grown up in conventions and seen problems with other conventions and what we love as part of these events, maybe just try to be better for the future. I don't know. That's just it's just kind of an open conversation. I think that
I will still say I want a 21 and up con so I can drink my breakfast mimosa and discuss the finer points of LUM with actual sophisticates like myself.
Good luck with that one.
It'll happen. My old roommate in undergrad, he had this brilliant idea for a 21 and up grocery store / bar, and if we can do that with a con, I think it could work.
only if the drinks are named after anime characters. So you go and you don't get a mimosa, you get a Goku.
This documentary is called Otaku Unite, and at the very start of the documentary, or at least after the kaiju battle part, we have Dave Merrill say,
of course, when you tell people what otaku means and the connotations thereof, they're like, well, this is America, this isn't Japan, so we can make it mean whatever we want. Like, it doesn't work like that.
And I'd like to point out, actually, that is how words work. Words change meaning all the time, and I have quite a few articles I can lead you to, Dave Merrill, that talk about the use of the word otaku in the Western sphere and how it is not necessarily... Okay, I'm going to go on my English major rant. But Bill, you pointed out that otaku is not a commonly used word anymore, and I think that's something that's worth discussing and exploring.
Yeah, I knew of the word otaku when I got into fandom, but it wasn't something that was kind of told to me like, you should wear this proudly. I think it was a kind of a revisionist view of the word at that time, where people were starting to realize like, oh, that's a bad derogatory word now, where I think now it's usually just either you're just an anime fan or a manga fan, or maybe the derogatory word now would be like weeb would be the derogatory word.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. It's just like whenever I was entering into this phase, it's like otaku was something I would see used never really like verbally. It was always something I would read, but people like in my day-to-day social functions, like talking about anime and stuff, you would either just say, I'm an anime fan, and then later on, weeaboo came along, and that was also very a derogatory thing that you did not use in a positive connotation for a while. And then it sort of got rebranded as like, oh yes, I'm a weeb, in the sense of like, kind of in the way that some people think about otaku. It's just like a thing that used to mean something really bad that you would use to make fun of people, and then it's sort of become like vernacular for like a slightly tongue-in-cheek way to call yourself an anime fan.
Yeah, otaku was back in the days of, speaking a few sentences in broken Japanese that you learned from anime to make yourself look cool.
Watashi wa otaku desu.
Yeah, this is like back in the day of those awful looking for a Japanese girlfriend t-shirts that you'd see people wear at conventions. Basic ass white guys wear at conventions. This sort of thing where calling yourself this foreign term, and it is very much the sort of Johnny Otaku thing. This guy that these people that are so into the community in and of itself, rather than looking at how it looks, or even trying to analyze or even think about the image they're projecting. It's just that was just part of it. That was just part of being proud of your nerd heritage.
And I guess I just have a problem with this whole "it is a bad word in Japan" because it's like it's a complicated word in Japan that has its own history and was not even the term used for a while. It was maniac before that, and I think just saying the sort of flat "it's a bad word in Japan, stop calling yourself that" also takes away the power of loan words. There are words in Japan that are loan words from us that don't even mean the same thing anymore. We have false friends in Japanese, as they call it. And I think otaku had the potential to be the word that was reclaimed and remixed into American culture to mean anime fan and could mean a positive thing, especially as Japan embraced the cool Japan thing and started saying, yeah, okay, otaku are okay. They're smart. They're weird, but they know a lot of stuff, so they're useful to our ends. And I still have that feeling of when people that normies ask me about my hobbies, I will usually just say I'm an anime fan. That means I collect figures, I collect Blu-rays and DVDs, I read books about the subculture and the making of anime in the industry. When I am with people like you guys, who I feel like are more in the know and like are on a certain level of fandom with me, I used to say, we're all otaku here. We're all people who the appeal of Japanese culture is still kind of something that makes us salivate. I'm reading Matt Alt's book, Pure Invention, right now. And even the idea of otaku as something we're all kind of becoming, people who are these techno-savvy dwellers of virtual worlds who use escapism. Like, I think all human beings in the age of social media are kind of becoming otakunized in both good and bad ways. I think it's a complicated word that has a lot more historical nuance than the sort of glib way of saying it back in 2006. And even when I was getting into the community in 2010 as "it's a bad word, don't call yourself that." That's how you kind of out yourself as a green fan. And as for weeb,
or coming off across as too eager.
Right, which is a whole thing.
Whole other thing, yes.
We as a society just hate eagerness. Eagerness is bad. Passion bad. And then the term weeaboo, which I use kind of in a way. It's like, God, weebs, like people who are either being bad or it's like a like if I am going to hang out with Austin, I might go like, "What up, weeb?" Like
As
it's
you
just
do.
as we talk, and it's weird. That was the term that was supposed to be, this is bad fans, and now it's just, fans in general, and it's the whole complicated, should we trash talk ourselves or not? These words have histories, and that's what makes them complicated, and I wish that was acknowledged.
Well, I mean, that's part of it, though. That's part of the history, and I think it's something that even, I don't necessarily think Dave says it outright, but there's something that both knowing sort of his views on the way the community is, and also knowing how the Japanese communities has evolved. Like, Dave talks later in the documentary about when they bring up cosplay and how, there's definitely, cosplay is definitely the most present aspect of the fandom. It is definitely very popular, but not everyone loves cosplay. And Dave has talked very openly about having to sit through the masquerade at AWA for several years until they turned into 5-hour affairs and being done with cosplay. And by the time this documentary came out, fandom was turning to cosplay as the main face of everything. And you look at someone like him who's watched these older shows, who's focused more on sort of the AV nerd aspect, more so than the dress up and convention or had costume aspect, and the way that parallels to the Japanese fandom. So the original Maniacs were very much about like production facts, about special effects used, about the animation itself, and then even the sci-fi aspects of the stories, and delving into what is very much something that is we've already talked about it talking the video. Like that is very much the older style of anime fan. And then you get into like the mid 90s, right after like Ava came out, and then you have otaku-dom became more like hikikomori. You have more focused on these moe characters. You have the conversations about which is the best girl. It wasn't about what stats does this Veritech fighter have, this Valkyrie, what's the missile payload, who did the the Itano circus, who drew these episodes. It was who's the best girl. And likewise, you have that in Japan, and you have the older fans sort of have railed against it. You have Miyazaki, you have Anno, who's talked about how that's negative. And I mean, hell, we could talk all day about how the fandom surrounding Ava drew Anno to sort of rail against that in End of Ava, including some of that hate mail that he got. That's all part of it. And to mirror that in Otaku Unite, it's just cosplay instead of the more hikikomori aspects. You've got this older fan group that is consider themselves like the OG, the original, fans, and they see a new generation that is not expressing themselves in the same way. And I think it's a level of frustration that you see these older fans that are really into the tech, that are really into, finding copies of these stuff and watching this stuff and sharing new works and translating these new works and talking about it. And you see these newer kids that are just want to cosplay and just want to dress up like their characters. And one of I think it's the first volume of the Colony Drop zine. I don't know if it was Helen McCarthy, but it was somebody in the UK section. I'll have to look it up and put it in the show notes. There's a quote that I don't think I will ever forget, where to paraphrase, our fandom was sitting in a small cramped hotel room staring at a small TV, watching a Japanese audio anime that no one could understand for the sake of it. But this new generation was all about dressing up and looking at each other. And I don't want to make that value judgment, which is better, which is more pure, which is a better expression of fandom. But this documentary focuses on that transition. And you do have the old guard seeing the new guard. And I think the word otaku and the transition, the meaning, the evolution of it, like you said, Sully, sort of does come up in this time frame, where you've got these newer fans like Johnny Otaku who are super excited. They're just happy to be there, that are using this term as an identity, an expression of their fandom. But you've got the older fans that have lived through these more awkward times, that see it for the dirty word that it has been. And can we retake that word and make it better? Sure. We talk about weeaboo. Weeaboo is an entirely internet era word. It came from a Perry Bible Fellowship comic. It was a word filter on 4chan and has turned into both something, like we mentioned, an insult, but also sort of a playful word. Just like nerd has. Nerd has been a negative term, but people have sort of recaptured that into something a little more playful. And, it's cool to be a weeb now. It's cool to be an otaku, a weeb, an anime fan, whatever term you want to say. It's definitely more in the mainstream now than it ever has been.
Tobias, I could listen to you talk about this all day.
Oh, yeah. Well, I was pretty much done. I
wasn't making a joke. I was being completely legitimate. I could listen to you talk about this all day.
No, I mean, I do have thoughts, and could have tying this back in what I said about leaving space for the younger fans. Not to sort of fanboy over too much about Dave Merrill specifically, but he's been the public head for anime fandom since I've been going to conventions. I remember going and seeing Anime Hell back in 2004. I've done that every year since. So I sort of followed in what he's said about cosplay, the cosplay community, and what other people have said in the transition between generations to another. And that is something I worry about myself. I very much want to talk about anime and Japanese culture. I do care a lot about production facts and, the people that made Evangelion, for instance, my favorite thing, the best anime ever made. Haha. But I do think that younger fans are going to find new aspects. You'd have cosplay, but it's a lot more casual now than we see even here in Otaku Unite. Are we still going to care so much about cosplay, or is that going to go away here in a few years? I do feel like maybe we've hit a peak for what cosplay is. Again, it is still very present, very it's definitely the face of the fandom, and it's very easy for anyone to get into. But I guess what I'm trying to say is I kind of want to make sure we leave enough space, because I don't want to be the guy trying to argue this isn't legit, in 10 years.
And this might actually need to be cut from the podcast because I could go on, but I also find it very fascinating Like, what are the outside of the anime fandom? What are the cultural, like larger global cultural trends that cause these changes? Like, okay, we had the hikikomori, like responding to Ava, but like Ava came out right during the bubble bursting, like in the 90s. Like, okay, December of 1989, or no, December of 90 is when the bubble burst in Japan. So these kids are probably depressed. Like, why is like so much of the sad boy aesthetic in anime now on like Twitter and stuff? Well, look at what's going on. Like, anime is a useful expression of current. I mean, this goes back to like the leftists, you know, saying we have our leftist newsletter in one hand and our Shonen Jump in the, or our Shonen Sunday in the other. Like this, these things feed on each other. And you talk about cosplay becoming more casual. Well, people don't have money anymore. Like, our disposable income is becoming less and less, and reactions to like body positivity and like comfort levels, and like the more that cosplays become sexualized and people maybe don't want to feel like that's something they're partaking in, like these are all larger cultural conversations that will then inform the subculture. That's, I'd love to read about like how has cosplay, just cosplay, changed in the United States as perceptions of cosplay have changed, economic situations have changed. Like, as one person told me, it's like people don't do cosplay that much anymore because it just costs too much money, and it became like you couldn't cosplay like these people do, where it's kind of, you know, Halloween costume tier. You have to be good or else people are going to make fun of you on the internet, or you have to be sexy, and not everyone wants to do that. Like, those are larger trends that will inform that. Like, why did A and Bs kind of die off? Who knows? Is it because editing software became too complicated? Was it taste in music change? There could be something larger that informs the subcultural aspect.
Nothing is ever just one thing.
For sure.
And we're all going to die.
Eventually.
Yay.
But we will enjoy some Japanese cartoons before we do.
If I had to go through life without knowing Lum before I passed, it would not have been worth living.
my life is more enriched now seeing Hatsune Miku.
So we've talked a lot about this documentary, about the changes in anime fandom, about our own predictions of where the fandom is going to go. Guys, I'm going to go one by one. If each of you had to like do a one-sentence takeaway from this documentary or a one-sentence review, what would it be? We're going to start with you, Bill.
This documentary is a time capsule of anime at a particular time before it became more reserved, more commercialized, and when it was a bit goofier. I'm not saying that's the best way that anime convention should be, but it was how it was at a particular time. And I would just describe this documentary as a time capsule.
How about you, Austin?
If you're asking me, should I watch this or should I not watch this? I think you should watch this. But just keep in mind exactly everything that we've said about how it is very much a time capsule. It is not a reflection of what anime fandom is today, and you should not expect it to be so, because it is 20 years old at this point, more or less. So if you're interested in anime fandom, or what perceptions about anime fandom were, or what some of the realities of anime fandom were in a specific moment in time, you should absolutely watch this. It is not perfect, but it is absolutely worth your time.
And Tobias, I'm going to leave the final takeaway from you.
This movie is a fever dream, man. It is wild. Specifically, I think minutes like 7 and 8, there's just a bunch of quick cuts that it's just a bunch of wild thing after wild thing that is. I had to wonder if like I dropped acid or something. Like, what the hell? What am I watching? What is this? Like, you've got some random old guy he's like, well, I don't know, man, they're dressed up like cartoon characters. I don't know. You've got people screaming like anime at the top of their lungs. You've got Dave Mill and a goatee and a t-shirt and a hot tub. It's just like it's a bunch of quick cuts that are just so. They just sum up the movie and to some degree the fandom, for better or worse, very quickly. I would agree that it's definitely something you need to watch to know what the fandom was like in the early 2000s. Again, for better or worse, it embodies. I think if nothing else, there are a bunch of big name bands here that are very important to anime history, that are important to see here. I will say that as much of we've talked about Carl Masick. I had never seen that man before. So to put a name to a face for the first time was really interesting. Even though we don't get nearly enough of the big name fans as I feel like we should have, it's still it's a worthwhile watch.
If you want some more recent sort of adjacent material to this documentary, you can listen to our interview with Helen McCarthy that we put up recently, and our interview with Robert Woodhead, who was also in the documentary from Animazement last year. So if you want to hear them talk about more stuff that is more relevant, I guess, to the modern era, go check those things out.
I will say, I was incorrect. I said Tobias would get the final word, but actually, we'll get the final word from none other than Dave Merrill himself, as performed by Austin in the Twitter thread that he posted 2 years ago after I saw this movie for the first time.
Okay.
So Austin, if you don't mind, please regale us with what
sure,
Mr. Merrill had to say.
Oh, well, Dave doesn't say too much, but I did ask him back in 2018, sort of, if he had revisited this documentary since being featured in it, and he had a couple things to say. He said, "It is a really fascinating time capsule," just like Bill said, "not just for the AnimeCon stuff. The film was shot right during some crucial junctures in my life, so there's a lot of personal context for me in the movie. I would still love to see an anime convention documentary that spent less time on cosplayers and more time on the practical work, staff meetings, prepping the technical stuff for video games and screenings and art shows, vendors, all the nuts and bolts stuff." And then I asked him briefly about Johnny Otaku, and he basically gave the story that Sully did earlier about how he moved to Texas to become a voice actor, but he got banned from every Texas Anime Con for stalking guests. And he is still trying to figure out what he was doing with that goatee.
And you know that a stalking guest is a thing that just doesn't happen at conventions anymore.
Nope, we've completely solved that problem. So this has been another installment of Otaku-mentaries. I would like to thank my wonderful panel, Austin, Tobias, and Bill. And next time, I'm hoping we'll do a documentary that's a little more incisive and a little less acid trippy, to borrow from Tobias.
Well, there you have it, folks. That was our Otaku Unite review. Thank you guys for waiting an absurd amount of time to actually hear this thing, and I hope you really enjoyed it. If you want to hear more about the podcast, please hit up our website over at thirdimpactanime.com. We're also on Twitter, pretty active on there, over at twitter.com/TI_anime. You can also find us on Facebook if that is more of your thing. And definitely don't forget to subscribe to us on your favorite podcast catcher. And if you do feel so inclined, please feel free to drop us a review over on Apple Podcasts. We also have a very active Discord community that you can find the invitation to over on our website as well. If you'd like to support us financially, you can help us by joining our Patreon, which is patreon.com/thirdimpactanime. Thank you again so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.